Hey there, creative coders. This is Benjamin D. Whiting, and welcome back to the SuperCollider segment of Null-state's interactive digital art tutorial series. Last week we talked about the basics of the client-server model and how they pertain to the SuperCollider programming language. This week we're going to acquaint ourselves with conditional statements on the client side of the language. Let's get started. A control structure ubiquitous to higher-level programming languages is the conditional statement. A conditional statement is one that evaluates a given condition and concludes whether it is true or false. Depending on the language used, multiple types of conditional statements may be available, the most common of which is the if-then-else statement. An if-then-else statement, often shortened to just if-then or even simply if, states that if X is true, then perform action Y, else perform action Z. If Z is not provided and X returns false, then nothing happens. Whether or not some action is performed, the instruction ends and the program moves to the next one. An action can be anything from setting a variable to some new value, evaluating some new function, spawning synths, to even performing another conditional check. Nesting if-then statements is not only possible, but quite common. If-then statements can be nested in either the true action or false action, or even both if the situation so demands. Though if one's nesting gets too complex, it's a good sign that a different approach should be considered. What should shock absolutely none of you who have been following this series up until now is that if-then statements provide several syntactical possibilities. The older, more established option, hailing from the SuperCollider 2 days on classic macOS, is the following, where the condition is the receiver of if, and the two functions are to be evaluated if the condition has been determined to be true or false. Just like argument declaration got a facelift upon the advent of SuperCollider 3, so did if-then statements. One now has the option to format them like so. This syntax adopts a format reminiscent of Java and JavaScript. Not to mention it is a tad friendlier to parse. Believe it or not, this is using function call notation. As .if is technically an instance method of the Boolean class, one could use the following syntactical approaches. The if-then statement is one component of SuperCollider for which I vastly prefer the former function call notational method, as it's quite a bit easier for us human beings to parse. Another very handy conditional is the case statement. Case goes through a list of conditional action pairs and evaluates them one by one. If a conditional returns false, the following conditional is evaluated. This process repeats until a result of true is returned. This construct can be instrumental in reducing or even eliminating the need for nested if-then statements, leading to cleaner and clearer code. There is only one syntactical possibility for the case statement, which is as follows. It's vital to understand that, as soon as some condition returns true, the instruction terminates. Therefore, if one anticipates the possibility of multiple conditions evaluating as true, and if one wants each of the relevant actions to evaluate, one might consider splitting up the case statement or choosing another kind of control structure, such as nested if-then statements. Finally, it should be noted that conditionals are completely within the purview of client-side programming. One can nevertheless achieve similar results server-side by utilizing simple arithmetic operations, which we will cover next episode. Let's get started today by constructing code that generates two random integers between 1 and 10, assigning the first to variable x and the second to variable y, and then comparing the two to see which is larger. By the way, some of you have asked for me to make the font bigger in SuperCollider, for which I am more than happy to oblige. We are treating x and y as local variables here, so we declare them by using the var tag. When programming on the client side, one must distinguish between integers and floats. SuperCollider doesn't make use of int and float tags like some other languages do, instead relying on the presence of a decimal point and a digit in the tens place, even if it's a 0, when setting a number to a variable or including it as an argument. .rand is an instance method of simple number that chooses a value between 0 and the integer or float specified. Here we're setting two different randomly chosen integers between 0 and 10 to x and y, respectively. Because it'd be nice to see what is being chosen for each, we'll have the post window print their values preceded by a string letting us know what value is being set. The strings are enclosed in double quotes with a trailing space. Both are connected to the variable in question by dual plus signs, which concatenate their results with the preceding string. The entire expression is placed between parentheses and followed by the .postLine instance method of string, which is responsible for printing the line to the post window along with inserting a carriage return, so that whatever comes next will start at a new line. Finally, we have our conditional in the form of nested if-then statements. First, we check for equivalence. This is accomplished by the use of dual equals signs. If x and y are the same, then the string x and y are equivalent is printed to the post window. If not, we move to our next conditional statement. If x is greater than y, then x is larger as what is posted and the process stops. Otherwise, the only other possible outcome is that y is larger than x, so that is what will be posted. Another nested if-then statement checking to see if x is less than y is not needed, as there can be no other result given the circumstances. Our code appears to be working without any issues. We're not yet done, though. Might there be a way to rewrite this code so that it depends on user input instead of random number generation? Feel free to pause the video for an opportunity to think. If you're thinking along the lines of placing this code into a function with arguments, you'd be correct. First, we need the variable containing the function to be global in scale so that we can freely evaluate it. I've chosen to use the interpreter variable f as it's commonly associated with user-defined functions, but feel free to label it as anything you'd like. You could just as easily use an environmental variable instead if you want to use more than one character. Next, as x and y are both functioning as arguments this time around, they are declared as such. Since we'll be choosing the numbers, integers or floats, to pass into the two variables, we no longer need to print their values in the post window, so that code has been deleted. Finally, I'm going to slightly change the wording of how the results will be posted. How we will go about evaluating this function is by using the .value instance method. The arguments of .value correspond to the arguments set up in our function, x and y. Let's test our code by comparing the integers 1 and 2. If everything's working as intended, you should see a message indicating that the second value is larger in the post window. Now let's try comparing the floats 15.7 and 3.33. Everything still seems to be in order. Incidentally, as a syntactical shortcut to .value, one can evaluate a function and pass values into its arguments by simply omitting the method name and appending what is to be passed into the function to the dot. Parentheses are still required, though. Now, what do you think will happen if we don't pass any values into the function? We still get a message indicating that both values are equivalent. This is because both x and y remain set to nil. What if we only pass one value through? Oops, we get a binary operator greater than sign failed error, as we're comparing a number with uninitialized data. We have two options for combating this. We could include default values of 0 in our argument declaration. This would prevent tripping any errors should any arguments not receive user-generated input. However, it may not always be desirable or prudent to presume default values in code that you write, especially when dealing with a cog that could be one of many powering a complex machine. The other option we have at our disposal is to include error text that would better inform the user on what they're missing upon evaluation. We could simply postline the text, but there's another method specifically meant for errors, as it includes extra information that might prove helpful when debugging, that being the method .throw. We want to tell the user that, if they did not input values for either x or y, we're missing values to properly make a comparison. This can be achieved by logical OR, denoted by two vertical pipes. With this new instruction, if x is nil or y is nil, SuperCollider will throw an error, complete with debug information, stating that there is missing input. Finally, let's expand this function to allow for the option of comparing three integers or floats. First things first, we need to add a third argument for a potential third value. Next, it's best to determine ahead of time whether two arguments have been input or three. This will be handled by an if-then statement and the .notNil instance method of object. z.notNil will return true if an argument is detected in the third slot, corresponding to z. If only two arguments are passed into the function, it will return false, so we'll want to transplant our original code into the else function of if. As working with three different arguments will likely result in numerous nested if-then statements, let's give the case statement a try. Recall that, as soon as the condition returns true, the instruction ends. Therefore, we want to make sure that we structure our case statement so that no more than one condition returns true at a time. This also means that, as we continue down the list, we do not need to be as specific when constructing our conditionals. You'll see what I mean in just a bit. Let's go ahead and write a condition action pair for when x will contain the largest value. This is where logical AND, denoted by dual ampersands, comes into play. We'll need x to be both greater than y and greater than z for this to return true, and if it does, the post window will confirm for us that the first value is indeed the largest. Next, we give a condition where y is greater than both x and z with an appropriate message for the post window. We duplicate this approach for z. Going forward, we don't have to be quite so specific. Here I type for the condition x is greater than z, but for the post window I specify that both the first and second values are equivalent and larger than the third. Why don't I need to include x equals y in the condition? Well, if x were greater than y, then the first condition in the list would have already been satisfied. Y cannot be greater than x as the second condition would have already returned true. So x being equivalent to y would be the only remaining possibility that makes sense. Taking a moment and applying similar logic to the next two possibilities explains those conditions' equal lack of specificity. What might not make so much sense is the last condition action pair. Why do I simply type true for the condition but make the claim that all three values are equivalent? The answer is simple. As it's the only permutation left, the conditional isn't needed. There is no other possibility that could come to pass. This case statement would only be executed if we pass three arguments into the function, so we wouldn't be missing anything, and every other combination has been accounted for. Therefore, we can simply have the function automatically return true, which is how one would format the default condition action pair for any case statement. That covers our introduction to if-then and case conditional statements on the client side. Next week we'll focus on trigger math, which will enable us to structure similar kinds of instructions on the server side. In the meantime, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel to show your support for more interactive digital music and art content from us at Null-state. Also, make sure to check out our Facebook page and webpage to stay up to date on all of our upcoming events, workshops, and concerts. The link is in the description below. See you next time!